In this video, I'm going to cover on the topic origins of agriculture, mainly based on two readings from the course. Cohen's introduction, Rethinking the Origins of Agriculture, and T.D. Price and Bar Youssef's The Origins of Agriculture, New Data, and New Ideas. The domestication of plants and animals by the Homo sapiens was a fundamental transformation in the history of the planet. It introduced new subsistence strategies for human societies, in addition to the variants of hunting and gathering, which had been the human adaptive strategy used throughout the Paleolithic and Mesolithic phases of prehistory, which were precursors to the Neolithic phase. The origins of agriculture, and which basically meant domestication of plants, and along with that, we also see the domestication of animals, has been one of the main contested areas of prehistory and an area of intense research. Along with plant and animal domestication, the Neolithic or the New Stone Age was characterized by sedentary life in permanent villages, use of pottery for storing and processing plant and animal sourced foods, use of a new type of stone tool technology which created ground and polished stone tools, which was and a heavier stone tool kit, and beginnings of other crafts like weaving of textiles of wool and then cotton, and more complex social structures, to name just a few of these changes. Various disciplines of science and humanities have been involved in unraveling the processes which led to the beginning of this new phase of human history. And these cover areas like studies of ancient health, paleopathology, or the study of ancient diseases and injuries in humans and animals by examining their fossil skeletal remains, paleonutrition, paleodemography, genetics, studying social organization and political history, climatology, studying human behavioral ecology, and archaeobotany, etc. So, specialists from various fields have been involved in unraveling the processes which created the new adaptive strategy of humankind, including archaeologists, archaeobotanists, archaeozoologists, demographers, and archaeological geneticists. Before we review the development of ideas about the origin of agriculture, it would be useful to define certain terms. One of the terms often in use in prehistory and the Neolithic is mobility and sedentism. These are relative terms that describe a range of lifestyles from completely mobile to completely sedentary. Sedentism is also difficult to measure in the archaeology of the hunters and first farmers. And one of the ways in which to determine if habitation was sedentary or to what extent it was sedentary is to look at the presence of commensals such as house mice and the seasonal distribution of plant foods within the same site, which then would indicate an annual long term occupation. Another term in use is management, which implies manipulation and some degree of control of wild species of plants or animals without cultivation or morphological changes. Then there's cultivation, which implies intentional preparation of the soil for planting wild or domesticated plants. And in many cases, it is identified by the presence of arable weeds in the cereal caches. And sometimes cultivation also indicates cultivation of wild plants before domestication. Domestication is a term which actually implies morphological or genetic changes in plants and animal species. And archaeozoologists also use criteria such as age profiles, milking, and osteological pathologies. Farming is a term which indicates utilization of domestic plants and or animals for food as well as other resources. Agriculture, on the other hand, is defined as farming and or herding as the predominant activity of a particular community, which then determines the main diet, although hunting and gathering may continue. We can best understand ideas about the origin of agriculture if we consider the early theories first. These early explanations of domestication include the oasis hypothesis, natural habitat hypothesis, population pressure hypothesis, the edge hypothesis, and the social hypothesis mainly. During the first half of the 20th century, the best information on early farming villages came from the riverine areas or oases in Northeast Africa and Southwest Asia, mainly along the River Nile in Egypt and at Jericho in the Jordan Valley. Early views on the origins of agriculture focused on climate change. During that time, the end of the Pleistocene was assumed to have been a period of increasing warmth and dryness in the Earth's climate. Scholars reasoned that because the ice ages were cold and wet, they should have ended with higher temperatures and less precipitation. In this context, areas such as Southwest Asia were viewed to have been a dry region to begin with, and with significant aridity at the end of the Pleistocene, where vegetation would have grown only around limited water sources. The oasis hypothesis suggested a circumstance in which plants, animals, and humans would have clustered in constrained zones near water. We Godden Child was the main proponent of this idea, argued that the only successful solution to the competition for food in these situations would be for humans to domesticate and control the animals and plants. Thus, domestication was seen to have emerged as a symbiotic relationship mainly for the purpose of human survival. However, new evidence emerged during the 90s, 40s, and 50s, which suggested that there was no dramatic climate changes in Southwest Asia at the close of the Pleistocene. This new information forced a reconsideration of the origins of agriculture. Robert Braidwood pointed out that the earliest domestication should have appeared where the wild ancestors lived. And with this view, he gave the natural habitat hypothesis. He thus suggested that it was the hilly flanks of the Fertile Crescent in Southwest Asia which should be the focus of investigations, and Braidwood and a large team of researchers excavated at the site of Jarmo in northern Iraq and in other sites in the Fertile Crescent. They found evidence of early agriculture and sup- used this evidence to support the hypothesis that domestication was tied to the natural habitat. However, Braidwood did not offer any specific reason as to why domestication occurred, other than to point out that technology and culture were ready by the end of the Pleistocene and that humans were familiar with the species that were to be domesticated. During those decades, archaeologists and generally considered that farming was highly desirable and an invention that provided security and leisure time for the prehistoric people. However, Louis Binford challenged these ideas in the 1960s and instead focused on population. Binford argued that farming was backbreaking, time consuming, and labor intensive. And he cited studies of ethnography where hunter gatherers were seen as spending only a few hours a day obtaining food, and the rest of the time was spent in leisure activities and other general pleasures of life. Even in very marginal habitats like the Kalahari Desert of South Africa, food collection was a successful adaptation and people were seen to rarely starve. Binford therefore argued that human groups would not become farmers until they had no other choice. Thus, this shifted the paradigm where instead of agriculture being seen as a natural progress towards a better means of food procurement, now agriculture was seen as a last resort. Pinford also emphasized that there was an equilibrium between food and people, and this was a natural balance that could be upset by either a decline in available food or an increase in the number of people. Now, in Southeast West Asia, because climate and environmental changes appear to be minimal and therefore Binford assumed that it would have been increased population size that would have upset this balance in the habitat. Thus, now population pressure was introduced as a prime causal agent for the origins of agriculture. More people required more food. Binford's emphasis on population as a causal factor was elaborated and extended as a global explanation by Mark Cohen. Cohen argued that there was an inherent tendency for growth in human population, and this was responsible for the initial spread of the human species out of Africa, the colonization of Asia and Europe, and then eventually the Americas. Around by around 10,000 BC, all the habitable areas of the planet were occupied, and according to Cohen, population still continued to grow. There was also an increase in the use of various kinds of resources, land and water resources, and also new kinds of plant species, which were added to the human diet around the end of the Pleistocene. So Cohen thought that the only way for this increasing population of the species was to turn to a new uh, strategy for food procurement, which was to cultivate the land and domesticate the animals instead of simply collecting the wild species. Cohen had argued that the widespread and roughly simultaneous adoption of agriculture across different regions cannot be explained by isolated regional factors alone. Instead, according to him, there must be simple, uh, common cause or a set of events with a core underlying these global changes. According to him, the shift to agriculture was driven more by push factors like necessity, demand, or population resource imbalance rather than pull factors like new technology or knowledge. Thus, agriculture arose out of a need, not just opportunity. His model centered on population pressure as a push factor, which was an imbalance between population size and available resources. This pressure could result from population growth, declining resources, or political factors, forcing societies to change their subsistence strategies. While change did play a role, according to Cohen, it was not the sole or primary factor, as its effects were regional. Evidence from paleopathology and human behavioral ecology showed that as societies transitioned from hunting to agriculture, health generally declined and the risk increased. This can be seen in the skeletal markers, in nutrition, and the disease rate. Studies also show that labor efficiency decreased as diets broadened and societies became more dependent on agriculture. People preferred immediate returns and risk avoidance, which then influenced economic strategies, and they were turning more and more to agriculture. At the same time, the shift to agriculture brought changes in population structure, fertility, and mortality, and increased fertility also often led to increased mortality, though the demographic effects of the shift to agriculture are still debated. Cohen concludes that the global move towards agriculture after the Pleistocene was driven by widespread imbalance between resources and demand, but the exact mechanisms and the regional variations remain extremely complex and not fully explained. There is, however, very little evidence for population pressure in the record of agricultural origins. Population is difficult to grasp in prehistory, and there are a very few cases where some information is available, and it may in fact be the case that most of the evidence of growing population comes after the origins of agriculture, not before. Thus, various scholars argued that the transition to farming and food storage and surplus could not be understood simply in terms of environment and population, and they developed the social hypotheses to explain the origins of agriculture. Barbara Bender and Brian Hayden suggested that the origins of food production may lie more in the ability of certain individuals to generate a surplus of food and transform that surplus into more valued items, such as rare and valued materials and subjects. Thus, agriculture was the means through which social inequality emerged and egalitarian societies became hierarchical. However, again, such views are very difficult to document, and it becomes a chicken egg question of what came first. There is subtle evidence for social inequality in the early Neolithic of the Near East, according to Price and Bar Yosef, but such reorganization of social relations and wealth accumulation may be a consequence of agricultural production rather than a cause. In recent years, the school of evolutionary ecology in archaeology has given its views on origins of agriculture. Evolutionary ecology developed out of an earlier perspective known as cultural ecology, and the focus of this approach was on the dynamic relationship between human society and its environment, using culture as a primary mechanism of adaptation. However, culture was a difficult concept to work with in prehistory, so evolutionary ecologists emphasized human abilities to reason and to optimize their behavior. In this view, natural selection is thought to operate on the behavior of individuals. Evolutionary ecologists assumed that natural selection led organisms to adapt to local conditions in optimizing ways. Thus, they developed a concept known as optimal foraging theory, which was borrowed from biology. And this was to explain the food getting behavior of humans, especially hunter gatherers. Optimal foraging theory argues that the most efficient foraging strategies produce the greatest return in energy relative to time and effort expended. Thus, humans made rational decisions based on economic efficiency. Ideas about agriculture and its origins have been categorized also as either push or pull models. Hunter gatherers are thought to be either pushed to become farmers or they are pulled, that is, drawn by the benefits of a new lifestyle. Population pressure models force basically consider human society to be forced to find new ways to feed growing members, while social hypotheses usually involve pull, in which members of society are drawn into relationships of inequality in order to benefit from new arrangements which reduce risk or increase wealth. Evolutionary ecology is also a push model where hunter gatherers operate on the premise of efficiency to acquire sufficient food to eat, and foods are ranked according to net energy value, and lower ranked subsistence resources such as seeds are added only as higher ranked food become unavailable. Thus, push perspectives appear to assume that hunter gatherers survived among limited resources in difficult environments. However, one of the most important and enlightening realizations in recent years is that agricultural origins took place in relatively abundant environments, not in places where little food was available. In such situations of sufficient subsistence resources, where risk was limited, e- experiments leading to the origins of agriculture took place. Higher ranked food resources do not appear to have declined or become unavailable in such contexts, and this brings into question the utility of these optimal foraging models. More recently, detailed information on climate change has emerged from the ice sheets in the Arctic glaciers, and they have provided evidence that there was a 33% increase in the atmospheric CO2 at the end of the Pleistocene. Higher levels of CO2 would lead to expansion of temperate species such as grasses, which include many of the ancestors of the major domestic species. Nonetheless, the full implications of such changes in the atmosphere are not yet clear, but definitely they would have played a role in the transition from hunting to farming. Evolutionary ecologists also picked up on the CO2 data and argued that it was a climatic amelioration that followed in the early Holocene, and with the rise of CO2 that made the origins of agriculture compulsory. The transition to agriculture is a common human experience, point out Price and Bar Yosef, that has affected us all in terms of rapid population growth and aggregation and social inequality. The question is that is it the worst mistake in the history of the human race or an inevitable step in the evolution of human society? In recent years, a number of developments have taken place which further the understanding about the origins and spread of agriculture. There are new fieldwork studies and new sites in new and old places, more radiocarbon dates, new methods have emerged for documenting transitions to agriculture, even in areas which had been studied earlier, like West Asia or the Pacific and the Americas. There are studies of microscopic plant remains, especially starch grains and phytoliths. These have revolutionized identification of plant exploitation before the emergence of cultivation. Advances in the genetics of domestication, such as utilizing ancient DNA to examine the relationship among prehistoric domestics, are beginning to resolve standing questions about where and when. It is useful now to assemble this information as done by Douglas Price and Bar Yosef. And using this, they have summarized a more recent understanding, a current understanding of the origins and spread of agriculture. The research from varied disciplines has been integrated, and data on origins of agriculture has been collected from areas in East Asia and even lesser known regions like Papua New Guinea in Africa, Eastern North Africa, along with the data already there for West Asia and other areas like Central and South America. Thus, Douglas Price and Bar Yosef have constructed a table of the latest information, and they have recognized that there are at least 10 different places which can be seen as original centers of domestication, including Southwest Asia, where plants were domesticated as early as 11,500 BP and animals by 10,500 BP. There are other areas which you can see in the table here: China with millet and rice, Mexico with corn, South America with plants and animals, 10,000 and 6,000 BP, New Guinea plants very early, then South Asia plants and animals, Africa and Northeastern Africa. Thus, the antiquity of domestication has been pushed deeper into the past in many areas. And along with that, there is also an understanding that there was a synchronicity in the timing of the first domesticates around the end of the Pleistocene. Another commonality is that uh, farming originated in rich environments and not marginal habitats. Along with that, experiments in domestication are seen to be where there were concentrations of population and resources as across the globe. Thus, in each area where several different species were involved in the transition to agriculture, that is, species of plants and animals, there were also multiple centers of domestication within the region. Thus, whereas the 10 centers of domestication have been identified, within those also there would be further centers of domestication. The interesting fact was that there was not pattern that can be seen in the origins of farming, but variations. That means that there is a zone of variability at the origins of agriculture. The point at which origins took place, there is a lot of different evidence from different areas, and there appears to be a period of chaos at this point of shift. Three recent discoveries from the earliest Neolithic emphasize this zone of variability. And this is the colonization of the Mediterranean island of Cyprus by late pre pottery Neolithic A and pre pottery Neolithic B, people who carry domestic plants and domestic and wild animals by boat. There are excavations at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey, where a series of remarkable shrines have been discovered, where large stone architecture and art has been found from earliest Neolithic. Contemporary is a burial ground of Kafar HaHoresh in Israel, where new variations in the treatment of the dead can be seen, and indications are of emerging social inequality from this time. Farming or the Neolithic has been called a revolution because there were major long term changes in the structure and organization of the societies that adopted this new way of life. And it was a new relationship with the environment. Hunter gatherers had a different strategy where they lived off the land in an extensive fashion, exploiting a diversity of resources over a large areas. On the other hand, farmers utilize the landscape intensively and create a milieu that suits their needs. This change from community to household levels of economic organization can be seen in several areas and may have accompanied this transition to agriculture, which may have included a shift from communal sharing to familial or individual accumulation. The causes for the origins of agriculture are still not settled. There is no single accepted theory, and a series of ideas and suggestions have been made. A number of potentially important variables involved in this shift are sedentism, storage, population density, population pressure, resource abundance, resource availability, niche construction, processing and harvesting technologies, climate and environmental change, ownership of produce and resource localities, potential domesticates, competition, inequality, risk reduction, nutritional requirements, choice, chance, and a receptive sociocultural context. Thus, the emphasis now is to look at a multiplicity of factors and to look at the variability in multiple centers of agricultural origins.